one of the questions we were asked is, look, you've got this chain of people. Who does what? What's on my shoulders? And people who look at joining and saying, well, I'm going to set up BMO. That's great. I build devices. What's the cost on me? What's the complexity? So I'll walk through that. Obviously, there are many ways you can look at the supply chain. And so it's a highly effective, flexible solution. And there's a lot of ways you can deploy it. It doesn't demand that you do it. There are people saying, we'd like you to be more prescriptive, at least give us some kind of normalized approach that says this is how we would recommend you do it. And so this is kind of a hot topic in the working group now, whether we should be a little bit more prescriptive. What we are keen to do is really get input from the ecosystem to define this sort of normalized flow, so that whether you're a box builder, a silicon provider, a software provider, maybe you're somebody who creates credentials, whatever. Tell us how you feel, what would work best. So with that, and again, there are a lot of models here, but I'll go through, let's call it a fairly classic one, where you've got a manufacturer, they build a box, they set up all the credentials the way you heard, manufacturing, they ship it to the next person, which in this case is the distribution company. They receive the box. They extend the ownership voucher. Remember, they've received it. They're going to extend it to the next person in the chain. The box moves along. The ownership voucher moves along. And in this case, I'm going to say there's a system integrator. It's a manufacturing plant. I've paid for a system integrator to do the work. They will install the box, connect the network, and actually potentially do the onboarding to the device management platform up here. And then this is the end user who's paid the bill all along. They basically say, thank you very much, I'm in control. But that's a model, not the only model. And I'll show you some other models. But if you want to jump in with questions, feel free.
Yeah, I mean, that's the right flow, but it doesn't end at 4. Because once the device is deployed in the field, you will need to constantly kind of change the firmware, software. And that has a life cycle.
Yeah.
Until the device dies, and there is an end of life cycle. So that picture should be extended to make it complete.
Totally agree. And I think as we get into the FIDO bare metal onboard, that's when you start to look at how it can be used to do software updates on the device. And I think that leads very much into that conversation, because as you say, eventually you may have to reset the device to a known good state. You may have to reinstall the software. So there's lots of interesting things we could do there.
So I would also say that in FDO, because onboarding is a change of trust, we focus on onboarding, and we understand that that part of onboarding will be to set up a structure by which you're going to maintain the device over a long period of time. There are some situations in which you might re-onboard the device because you're changing everything, but we assume there's some additional mechanism that every site will have to maintain it, and we didn't actually solve that problem. If you think FIDO should be solving that problem, we're happy to go and discuss that. That would be fine, but that's not what FDO is.
Thank you.
The original FIDO, SDO became FIDO was aimed at the duration of time between the time it left the manufacturing point and the time it was installed. Because at that point, the box is closed. You have to be able to maintain the ownership information and be able to pass that outside of the box. And you don't want to have to open up the box at the system integrator and then close it back up. It's going to get shipped to the place and open it up and have to touch it each time externally. So this was basically meant for that transparent period. It wasn't intended for this entire lifetime. But the same technology and the same building blocks can be used to establish that and continue that onto the end of its life.
Okay, because then it doesn't tie very well with CRA requirements.
So I think the point that Reid's making, when we started, our mind was very much the first 5 minutes of life. We're going to onboard and we're going to walk away. After that, it's your problem. But I think increasingly people are realizing that FDO can do much more, and it can trigger the software download. People have demonstrated that. And I think, as Reid points out, there's an opportunity now to use the fundamental building blocks of FDO to do much more of that tracking and lifecycle management. And when Brad joins us, we'll dive into it. So I think you hold those conversations with Brad, because I think that will be perfect. Again, as soon as he can join us. But if you look, we've tried to define what kind of roles the manufacturer does, as you can see, in terms of obviously installing the client, programming the rendezvous. That was a topic that came up. Running the manufacturing tool to create the OV. Putting credentials into the device. Maybe it's TPM, maybe it's not. That's a conversation we're going to have in a minute. Extending the ownership voucher and then sending it on to the distributor. And then we talked about them signing the OV. And then if we move on to the next slide, system integrator gets the box, receives the device, they install it, extend the OV, load the OV into the system and power it on. And what we tried to do in this, and again, this is obviously you can take these slides and read them offline, is give a little bit of a taste as to what kind of skill set and capability is needed. Because one person in the ecosystem doesn't have to know every single piece of the puzzle. They just need to know the bit that relates to them. So I won't get too bogged down on that. The distribution of the ownership voucher, I mean, as we mentioned, it is extended through the supply chain. Clearly, if a person is using kind of a portal model, you can actually distribute via the portal. We talked about this, and again, I'm not going to, belabor it.
So the key on that third point is that the ownership voucher is not exactly the same as a key as like a physical key, right? Each entry of the ownership voucher is signed to a credential that's provided by the next owner. And so that means if I have a device and I'm sending it to Richard, I will get Richard's public key. So notice that Richard is now sending me some information that he didn't send me before, and I will sign the ownership voucher over to Richard. So now I can't use it. Now only Richard can use it, and then I'll send it to him. I can now put it in a regular email. So if for example Reed gets it, he can't use it. Only Richard can use it, and the reason is Richard actually has the credential that is referenced in the ownership voucher. That's important, and that's part of the that's part of the mechanism by which the ownership voucher actually works.
And then just to show you another model, in some cases you may have a case where you don't want to have the system integrator handle the ownership voucher, and you don't have to. The distributor could ship the box to the system integrator, but send the ownership voucher directly to the end user. Hey, it's my system. I want to manage it. The box is physically installed by the system integrator, but the onboarding is handled by the end user. So again, it's another model. It would depend on whether that worked for the people in the supply chain. Do you want to comment on this one, Jeff? Because I think one of the questions we get from people is, what can you do to further simplify things? Or what happens if we put a device in storage for 20 years and we can't find the ownership voucher? What happens in that case?
Right. So before the ownership voucher is signed, it's actually just like a capability. It's a bare credential, and of course it needs to be signed to be used. But if it's if you did get your hands on it before it was signed, anybody who takes it can use it. So you could, for example, if you were using something like a TPM or some secure storage in the device, you could put that proto ownership voucher in the device. And let's assume that you don't want an ownership voucher, you want a device on the shelf that you're able to install. Anytime you take it off the shelf, you would now have a bare bones ownership voucher that anyone can use. You can sign it and use it right away. And that's described, or let's say the basic idea of that is described in this document securing FTO credentials and the TPM, but actually it could work without a TPM. Any kind of secure storage would do that. Similarly, you could have if you have your user community has a server that they tend to use for, say, customer support or other things, and let's assume that server meets a certain security standard. You could have some kind of a credential in the box. We talk about it as card in the box, and we could say, well, yes, this is this code that's on the card in the box will indicate that you own the box. You ended up with the box, and therefore you get to have the ownership voucher. So log into your account, and then we'll dynamically sign the ownership voucher over to you. These are things you could do. The ownership voucher is flexible; it lets you do a lot of things. Obviously, security is something that you have to maintain constant vigilance to achieve fancy security. Therefore, if you don't want to have that level of security, you can still do it. You have to change your structure, but you would be able to go in and do that, and that would make sense, say, for a device sitting on a shelf, or for a device for situations where the ownership voucher is not practical. You want to ship devices, and you have some level of say tamper resistance that you already trust within the device.
So I guess the point there really is you can make trade-offs. If you're willing to trade off some security to simplify your flow, or as a stepping stone, some companies are saying, what can I do to start with FDO today that doesn't require me to do kind of some of the handling of the ownership voucher? And these are stepping stones that would get you there. And the one I will spend kind of the last slide on is this whole idea of pre-programmed TPM. So we'll come to it later. And what's attractive about it is if you're a manufacturer like an ODM or an OEM, and you say, look, I really don't feel comfortable today having all of the handling of the different certificates that I have to be a true FDO manufacturer. I want to do it, I'm just not ready today. Then you could go to a company, we'll talk about that later in terms of real companies, but go to a company and say, I'll buy my TPMs from you, I'll have them pre-programmed with FDO credentials. It's possible then that they can do one of two things. You could either have them place all of the ownership vouchers in a portal and you can claim them when you install the TPM, or you can actually put the OV inside the TPM. And it depends on how you trust your supply chain. But let's imagine we do that. We decided I'm going to be handed this TPM. The TPM now contains all my FIDO FDO credentials, and it contains the ownership voucher. I'm the ODM. I stick it in the board. I ship it to Joachim. He says, thank you very much. He ships it on to Reed. And we're now at the point where we're going to install it. The last person in the chain can extract the ownership voucher from the TPM and then use FDO to do all of the onboarding. And so again, if that's a trade-off that makes sense for people to say, hey, you've automated my onboarding, I trust some of my supply chain, again, that may be a mechanism that's available. And I think it's an interesting concept for some folk.
But that's an unsigned ownership voucher, so you have to think the security through. Yeah.